I had sinus. Okay, well, thanks for coming to this panel on poetry and technology. My name's Jim Andrews, and this is Natasha Boskic. So I guess we should introduce ourselves to you before we start. Maybe we should just introduce ourselves, right? That seems like we have some experts here on ourselves namely. So we can do that.
Sure.
Why don't you go first, Natasha?
Okay. My name is Natasha Boskic, and I work at UBC with technology. That's part of my job. But I'm a poet and a writer, and I was always curious. I have always been curious about the combination of technology and poetry, and so it's interesting that that you have the same questions in the audience, because I hope the conversation can go into that way and explore a little bit that combination. So for me, it's always experimentation and trying to see how technology can work with poetry in different ways. So I do have different projects like video poetry or poetry in different media, and we were talking a little bit about that before the session, exploring poetry in textile, exploring poetry in edible poetry, which is on wafer paper, and making some interesting combinations with augmented reality and how we can make something live out of an object. So we will have a workshop at 1:00 where we will try to do some hands-on and maybe demonstrate some of that work. But for me, poetry should be fun and everywhere. So if we can do that, I think bringing poetry to people around us is what I like to do.
My name's Jim Andrews. I've been publishing a website called vispo.com since 1996. It's my life's work. This website is my life's work. And on this website, you will find all sorts of interactive poetry. It's a matter of mouse and keyboard interactivity. I'm also an audio artist. I produced a literary radio show called Fine Lines and later Frame for 6 years at CFU-VFM in Victoria that I distributed to 15 campus community stations around the country. And that's how I started my engagement with technology as a poet. That was back in the 80s. And then I studied, after I did my English degree, I did a lot of math in that. And then after the radio show, I went back and studied several years more of math and computer science. But at that point, in the late 80s, I didn't have a clue about the interest of computers in literary matters. It just wasn't a thing at that point. But it wasn't really until the web came along that ding, 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 I understood that this was the medium for me, because I could combine my interest in audio and with programming and with visual stuff and poetry and text. It's a great place to combine all of these media and arts with an interesting interactive dimension to it. So I like to think that my site is one of the best sites in the world on interactive poetry. And that's what you'll find at my site, vispo.com. And recently I've been working on a piece that Natasha has a poem in and Kedrick has a poem in. It's called Sea of Poe, which is a mag app. It's a magazine. It's got the work of 46 poets in it. But it's very interactive, and you can actually create your own texts and save your own texts. So it's a magazine, it's an app, it's very visual, but it's also very textual. So that's something of my involvement in poetry and technology. But your turn.
We were talking about the questions that we can raise or ask each other, and one of the first questions I had is why we are doing this, what we are doing this. So that's a question for you. Why do you do it?
Right. Well, it's basically the only thing I can do at this point. But why this sort of involvement with poetry? Well, I guess there's all sorts of reasons. I mean, one of them is that the internet is such an interesting thing in terms of a medium for poetry. It's global. Sea of Poe, the app that I told you about, the Mag app, the app zine, whatever it is. It's got the work of 46 people. It's got 13 or 14 languages, work of 13 or 14 languages in it, English and Chinese, English, and it's English and this, English and that, or patois. It's got Trinidadian patois, English and French. It's got Chinese. Natasha has a piece in English and Serbian. So it's the most exciting medium for publishing poetry because you can do all these strange things that you just simply can't do in print. So for me, it's why do I do it? Because it's the most exciting medium for poetry at this point, I think.
Yeah, I agree with that. I talked already a little bit how I like the poetry to be among us, but I think the technology brought that accessibility to different at the same time, right? Because I think in the past you write and you publish, and that's one process, but then you can do so much more, I would say easier, but also more difficult, right? Because nothing comes that easy, even though it seems easy. It takes a lot of time to work with technology and to create something. But I think it's quite an exciting time in terms of publishing and in terms of poetry and seeing the words, especially in your app, right? The words are coming and showing, and it is something visual that you have to see in order to understand. But I love languages. I like experimenting with words, and my poetry is not experimental in terms of the words. It's almost like a storytelling, but the words in itself and how they can be experienced by different senses, I think that's quite exciting at this time. And I'm always searching for other people who are doing similar things to see and be inspired, because I think people have such a vast imagination and approach to words.
Yeah, it's got all sorts of possibilities. One of the interesting possibilities that has come up recently is something called WebRTC, Web Real-Time Communications. And that's how things like Zoom were created. There's no plugin for Zoom. It's all via JavaScript and HTML and CSS, which is the languages that one uses to put stuff on the web. And one of the interesting things about the web is that there's always these new technologies coming in that pose new possibilities. All of a sudden you can write chatting and video chat apps that involve poetry. Well, you couldn't do that before. I mean, how often does it happen in print that, gee, there's this new development that lets you do something new in print? I'm betting it's not as much as what happens on the web with this continual development of new technologies that open up communication possibilities and art possibilities. So that's, a really exciting dimension of what's going on with poetry and technology, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a question for me?
Sure.
I do have a question already prepared, so you can take your time or you can ask me.
Well, actually, I know that Natasha works at UBC in the education department. She's involved in educational technology. I think she's the head of the section on educational technology at UBC. So, question is, how is that relating to poetry, would you say?
That's an interesting question. Yes, I work in the Faculty of Education, and I'm a director of the unit that supports faculty members in developing courses that are online or using educational technology, learning technologies. I think there is poetry in that. I'm sure there is, but it's also the way we learn. I think you always have different approaches to learning and different approaches to understanding. And I think that's, for me, is quite an exciting element of my work because of that design of the space where we engage differently. And even though I have been working with the same people over the years, there is always something different that they want to explore or want to do with their students, or they have different students at different time. And so I think that's what made me more interested in me exploring further. So I think that my work supports what I do. Yeah, it does.
Mm-hmm. So the relation with how we learn.
Yes, yes. And again, with people who are having different ideas and coming up with impossible things. And then you put them on the table and you said, is it really impossible?
Mm-hmm.
Because I think a lot of things are possible. It's just how you get to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What I was thinking about when I said I have a question is because your work and my work are quite different, and the approaches to, and in some sense you are inviting other poets to contribute to your app. There is Kedrick. So hopefully this will be
punctuality is to be noted.
Yes. This will be a question for you as well. I'm posing a question, just starting.
Great.
Okay.
Great.
And I think both of you, in some sense, you invite other people to contribute to your platform or to your system that you develop, and you're trying to outsource and bring more people together. And in some ways, that leaves the permanent digital footprint, right? It stays. While I'm working with something that you see, eat, and it's gone, or experience, and it's disappearing. So tell me more about that. Maybe I'll give you some moment to take your breath and let Jim respond first, and then maybe you can talk about your project more and introduce yourself, because we introduced ourselves. Okay.
Well, impermanence and the web is certainly an issue. I mean, from 1999 to about 2010, I did a lot of work using something called Director, which was basically the big brother of Flash. Both of them are dead now. Flash is dead, Director is dead. I've ported some of that work into the current venues, which are JavaScript and HTML and CSS. But a lot of that work is simply not viewable anymore, except, if you do quite a bit of work to set your browser up so that you're using the Pale Moon browser, and you install the old Shockwave plugin, and it's only available for Windows. So, a lot of my work is that I did for very serious work it's hard to view it now. So it's not so different, and how long will the current stuff that I'm making be viewable? Well, it's hard to say. 50 years is a long time with this sort of stuff. Whereas, books, we still have books that were written thousands of years ago. So very different sort of timelines with something that you eat and then it's gone. Well, it's not so different, what I'm doing, but it does seem that even so, it's important to do. It isn't necessarily just how long it lasts that is the important matter. It's the effect that it has on people and what we can learn and experience from these things, not necessarily just how long it lasts. But great to see you, Kedrick. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm Kedrick James. I have, I think, a fairly long history with publishing in Canada, in the West Coast. Began publishing with actually at Gestetner when I was a teen, and then A.B. Dick tabletop offset that we published a magazine and mailed it out to everybody with handwritten letters. I was reflecting just the other day about what has happened to the handwritten letter. It has been probably years since I've received a handwritten letter. So there's an
I'll write to you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I'll give my address and you're all welcome to write to me. Thanks for coming. And back in the 90s, we were running the Small Press Action Network, which was a Canadian affiliated network of presses, usually small or intermediate, so not the McClelland and Stewart level of publishing, but a lot of independent publishers. And it's very interesting to see over time what's happened to all that work. It tends to, because of its idiosyncrasy, become fairly collectible. So it takes on a certain fetish value. It winds up, if people had the foresight at the time and the will to put things in special collections of universities or libraries, public libraries, it had a certain kind of staying power. But it was also done largely as an ephemeral act. So in that same kind of Hakim Bey temporary autonomous zone where art occurs in the moment and in the instance of its manifestation, you kind of have to be there to experience it and then take away with it this lasting memory of something out of the norm that you encountered that drew you in through a literary practice. That to me is a very special aspect of publishing. So it does seem that one of the aspects of permanence or impermanence within the digital domain is conditioned by the vast increase, in fact, excess of information that we're encountering. So it's like there's just layers and layers and layers of sediment every single day dropping down on top of it. So to sort that out and decide this is a work of literary merit, this is a piece of garbage fake news, becomes almost, well, not impossible, but extremely difficult. So the value of particular pieces of information is removed from that idea of they have this lasting fetish value. They trace histories of people, of cultures, of scenes, of places, and it becomes this much more generic artifact. So to that end, I mean, I'll just say that the project that I'm currently working on and kind of representing here is a project called PhoneMe. PhoneMe is a social network for place-based spoken poetry. It absolutely encourages people to contribute and to be a part of it, because I want it to be a venue where people can explore and engage in poetry, writing about places that matter to them. So trying to take this digital nowhere land and move it into the specifics of places and events that actually have meaning in our lives and have a way to share that with other people. It represents those places both with Google Street View or a a scenic photograph that you upload. It also puts voice. So you record yourself reading the poem and you publish it. You curate your own poems. And in this sense, the voice alone also acts as a very interesting trace to a sort of essential idea of the person, where the text doesn't. The text, we accommodated in our heads this idea that, well, now we've got generative AI, so we're never going to know who wrote what, when, where, and how that came to be as the proliferation of that particular technology takes off. But I think the key here that I'm driving at is, after developing this project, we did our initial workshops down in the downtown east side and started to develop voices of community that really needed to be represented and were always being represented by the outside. And we wanted to see what folks within those communities, how they wanted to represent themselves. And after that, we started moving towards, as an aspect of digital literacy, using phones. So we developed over a process of some years a mobile phone app that, you know, I can share with you. It's still downloadable from Google Play and the Apple Store and all that kind of thing. The reason I bring it up is that of the last little while, what's happened is there seems to be almost a zeitgeist shift within technology that's putting all that within. People are not really seeing their phones in the same way. Their phones are taking a much more utilitarian aspect. Yeah, you know, you snap a photo once in a while, but the creative uses of that incredibly powerful technology that probably all of us have in our pockets right now is really not where that's going. As well, we do a lot of work in schools. We're both in education, and there's a real resistance to students having phones on them in schools. It's very interesting because most of them have phones. So what we've done recently is now move it into a web app. And Jim, you have something to do with that decision, just to say. Jim was counseling me about these various different platforms and availabilities. So we're now almost finished developing a web app version of it so that you can do it all on the web. You can still use your phone to do it, but you can use your browsers and all. You don't have to download software from one of these app store sites. So I just say that is another part, like your experience with Director and the end of Shockwave and what have you. That's another a space within which time is changing the way we're engaging with information. Phones are starting to serve different purposes. And I can say that based on some research that we've been doing for the last 3 years, really investigating how, teacher candidates and students and community members use their phones and how they react and relate to the phone as a creative device. And it's very interesting to see that shift is happening quite dramatically. So one would have thought when we were developing a phone app that we were being somewhat, I hate this term, but cutting edge. We were trying to stay with the curve. Apps had proliferated already, of course, but we were trying to be on that, bring poetry into a new realm that is social media and mobile technology-based social media interaction. And funnily enough, by the time we got that thing launched and sort of in the works, the mood or the shift in the public perception of the use of their phone had already occurred. And now we were already starting to chase our tail and develop a web app, go back to a web-based platform to share literary work. So it's just interesting to pick up on this theme of permanence and impermanence.
Yeah, and I'm curious. I mean, I don't know whether the audience is ready to share something or to ask questions, but how do we experience poetry now? I mean, are we saturated with poetry? Why? We were talking about why we are doing it. I know I'm not believing that, but it's for the sake of argument. We are arguing here about the poetry and technology. So I'm just curious.
There's room for innovation. I mean, people are now really getting into this concept of forest baths and sound baths. Like there's baths of everything. What about a poetry bath?
Yeah.
Maybe we should just all read poetry in all sorts of different languages and just, run around.
Yes.
Right?
Right.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I think that poetry and writing is great for multimedia stuff. I mean, no reason why it has to stay on the page, and it is text based. Everything with computers involves text, so you know, it can involve image, it can involve sound. It can be very. The experience of poetry is easily taken to all sorts of different media and all sorts of different arts as well, and that seems to be, you know, one of the main ways that I experience poetry. Although I also use the libraries a whole lot. We've got great libraries here in Vancouver, and I have memberships at 3 of them actually. But you know, and the libraries are very active in poetry, and so I think it's not just either or. I think poetry is one of the exciting things about poetry now is it's spreading into all sorts of different media and arts.
I'm not the one asking questions all the time. So.
No, I thought
no.
maybe you would respond to your own question.
Yes, poetry dad. No, I think because I talked a little bit about that at the beginning while you were away. I think that poetry is all around us, and that it's nice to encounter poetry in different ways. And I think technology gives people more accessible way to do that. So we can encounter poetry where we don't expect, and we read some people that we don't expect to read. Yeah, yes.
Kedrick, PhoneMe is a fabulous app, whether it's a web app or a phone app. Can you talk about the actual application? You worked with a class of Indigenous students.
I did, with a community, very particular community, I'll just say, because it's the Nklakakmath speaking folks of the Lytton First Nation. And probably if you followed the news over the last 3 years, Lytton is the poster child of climate change in BC, in the sense that it has had terrific, horrific fires 3 years in a row, this year included. So part of it was to connect with that particular Indigenous community who have suffered, you know, a lot of loss. It hasn't been loss of life, but the loss of important spiritual places that they go. Now, you know, this is different than routine forest maintenance kind of fires, right? In BC, we're seeing devastating fires that are covering vast regions. And, you know, it's not just the human loss of property and things, it's all the animal life and plant life that is destroyed in the process. So the real goal here was to go and share in a voice of that community, so that it had a way to represent, you know, the loss, but also to do acts of reclamation. Not only reclamation of what is particularly of importance, places that held, you know, historical and traditional significance, but also as a part of language reclamation. So we worked with students ranging from about 14 right through to older folks, adults, and they worked with their elders. So they would write a piece about places that were specifically meaningful to them, and then go and work with their language and culture teachers, and they would brought in elders who would then help them to be able to express some of that. You know, not everything is translatable, but to be able to express at least portions of what they had written as poetry in Nklakakmath, so that they had the ability to share and propagate and help to restore and regenerate what is also a real issue, I'm sure you're well aware, with Indigenous languages, that a lot of them have been going extinct owing to the fact that they're not getting passed on. And an interesting note on that, if I could just say that we've been also working lately to get BC schools to allow Indigenous languages as second languages, because we still force students to learn English and French in order to get their Dogwood certificate and graduate from high school, where they may be trying their best to pass on or receive and propagate their own Indigenous languages. So just thanks for the question, Fiona. A really important aspect, I think, of the democratization of poetry. And I'm just going to say that because poetry has generated its own cultures, literary cultures. For a long time, those cultures were quite hegemonic. And a lot of that hegemony was put into play through the publishing empires, through the publishing world, gatekeeping and such. And so, which really loosened up in the 1960s, I'll say. The Canada Council came along and created this book grant for publishers, so it would support them publishing. And especially in the 60s and 70s, it was a major supporter of alternative publishing, of small press publishing. And we got a very robust literary scene out of it. But you had to kind of move into that world in order to really participate in it. And one thing that the web has promised, and to a degree has certainly fulfilled, in fact, that may be a key to the problem of excess, is that it has democratized the ability of people to express things online. One of the keys that I'll just say, and this is very closely related to why we came up with PhoneMe in the first place, one of the issues with that is that it tends to engender very rapid communicative practices. So, especially when the world of the tweet, now the X, I guess you call that?
Yeah, X.
Is it an X or is it an
Yeah.
exit? So the key is that much of it, the shortness of it, and this idea that you react spontaneously and throw stuff out there, seems to be engendering, even in the early days back in pre-internet bulletin board worlds, they had to have administrators because there were these flame wars. People would go and, from a quasi-anonymous place, start attacking each other over seemingly small issues. So it kind of intensified this divisiveness in the society. And so one issue around trying to develop PhoneMe was to create a way that you could engage in a social network that was about slow writing and slow reading. So you could take your time, ponder, allow thoughts to gel, give yourself a perspective, spend some time enjoying language, playing with words, and really engaging at that level so that you share something, confidently that you feel good about and might want to return to.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's one of the interesting things, is that with this app, we now have about 625 poems on there from roughly about 400 and something, I don't know the exact number, but over 400 people. And it's interesting for people to go back and revisit their work after a while, just on the permanence thing, hear themselves. And that's part of the joy of this particular multimedia, multimodal approach to poetry, is that you can actually not just go and see your words, but hear yourself speaking them and how you related to that at the time. It brings a lot of the personal along with it. So I think that, just to answer Fiona's question, the goal was really to look at a way that an app could support a less transient interaction or use of mobile devices and the internet and what have you to engage with literary expression.
How would they actually access it? Would they use it?
Oh, they would so they would download the app, which you can of course still do, and I'm happy to share that with you. Though if you look up PhoneMe on Google Play or the App Store, depending on what kind of phone. You can just look it up. It's PhoneMe, but I'm saying that as if it's two words. It's actually the word phoneme. It's just a play on words. It's always funny, explaining puns is generally not. It's an ill-advised practice.
I just had, you kept stressing like democratization and accessibility, etc. But one of the contradictions of the internet is that there's a lot of corporate ownership of these apps, and it requires a lot of admin and technological know-how and maintenance over time to access, for people to retrieve stuff, access stuff. So how do you kind of navigate that terrain of like having local control or community control and input? Because you said it's on Google Apps, and I'm sort of a techno peasant person, but I'm more interested in the back end of things. So who control, like, does Google have to be paid, or can you develop your own app, and do you have to, like, I just wanted to know the economics and politics behind it.
Yeah,
You see?
it's a good question. I mean, since I've been involved in the web since 1996, it's an issue that has come up more than once. It's kind of a continual issue. Kedrick said that he has now developed a web app rather than the app. If you develop an app, then it almost has to be distributed through the Google Store, the Apple Store, the Android Store, and you have to then update the app. There's this continual pressure to update the app and put in new versions of it. And so he said they developed a web app instead. Well, it doesn't have to be instead. You can have a web app and also via something called PWAs, which is progressive web apps. You can take your website and basically zap it and put it in the app stores. And that's what I did with my last project, and something that I'll do with the Sea of Poe project that I was mentioning. And, it is something that as a net artist, I'm continually battling. Is there's a lot of people who think that net art, web art is basically dead because it's just a corporate porn site now. The web is just a porn site or a store. And so that's certainly changed in the web since 1997. But I insist on a different space for the web. I insist that what computers are all about is creative expression, is creating interesting art. That is what computers are for, as far as I'm concerned. And I think to have space for that, to make space for that, is a very important thing in the culture. I mean, if there's no space for really interesting art on the internet, then all is lost, as far as I'm concerned.
So how do you fund it, or like how do you get people who are technologically savvy but are supporting the arts, the humanities online? Like, how do you maintain is it voluntary? Is it based on like, does the government support it? Does the educational institution support it?
Well, I would just say that at the time I was running a center in the Department of Language and Literacy Education, and going out and getting research funding to do this. It was very important to me to do two things. One, to make these freely accessible. So I didn't want people paying for this. Not that even when they pay, you're about to go make yourself millions of dollars. But the other aspect was, just to speak, because you mentioned the back end, what's also been crucial for the work that we've been doing is to comply with FOIPA regulations, which is Freedom of Information Protection and Privacy Act regulations. So we've especially gone so that we store everything on Canadian servers. That becomes a really key part of it, because as I'm sure you're well aware, if you store things in US servers, then it is open to whatever the NSA decide they want to go and hunt up. And I don't want some school kid here using the word Trump and suddenly becoming on a no-fly list or something. Or you maybe get celebrated for it now. So the key there is there are a lot of ethical considerations. And as Jim just said, one issue that certainly has been a big one with the app stores is this need to just constantly update. And if you're using a number of packages, something like PhoneMe, because of its multimodal thing, requires all kinds of different software packages. It becomes a bit of a Frankenstein after a while, compiling all these. And when one goes out of date and gets updated, it's not that you just replace that one. It breaks a whole lot of other functionality. So you got to go and then do a lot more programming and then release that, goes through their checks, and then it gets put out. So you're doing this constant updating, and that is a lot of work, and way beyond what I think you can get as volunteer programmer time. That's very challenging. So ultimately it will cost money just to keep something that's already developed and working available and functional. So
Yeah. But I think it's the nature of the web. I mean, since computers were invented, you have to, luckily, I don't have to buy a new computer every time now. At least that
you want to bake cookies.
Exactly. But that's, I think it's going into that direction that you have less of those changes, although they seem permanent, like constantly going on. But maintenance of the web is something that has been going on all the time. You have to count on that. So if you have at your school or in your workplace already a unit or someone who is dealing with that, making it as a package, maybe the initial investment, you have to put a lot of effort into that. But trying to figure and to choose something that will require less in the future, right? Like mobile app versus browser app, right? Something like that, then that at least can help a little bit with that maintenance. But it is, I mean, yeah.
Also, another thing is that I'm independent. I'm not at a university. But most of the activity of this sort is through the universities. I mean, like there's something, for instance, called the Electronic Literature Organization, which is now an international organization, but the ELO, not to be confused with the Electric Light Organ. But it started out as basically something that in the United States very much oriented towards scholars and artists in the United States, but now it's more of an international thing, but it's still very much oriented towards scholars and scholarship. So a lot of the activity is through these sorts of organizations. Well, there aren't too many of them actually, and through scholars and scholarship, rather than being an independent artist. It's just my passion. That's how I do it. It's my life's work, such as it is. But most of the activity is through the universities, and so you hook it in through there. Although you can also try and hook it in through arts grants, but that's certainly less reliable than Kedrick's got this digital literacy organization that he's developing, and so that's kind of exciting.
Let's think for a second what happened to the smart board. You know, when I was a school teacher, our school dumped pretty much its entire budget in probably 1999, somewhere in there, to buy a couple smart boards. Where is that smart board today? One wonders.
That's a smart word.
Yeah,
Good,
exactly.
good.
There you
Well
go.
said. A smart board is a thing that looks like a whiteboard. It's a little bigger than this, maybe not quite as wide, but a little taller, and allowed you to use it like a giant screen. You could also draw on it with, you know, touch markers, and you could use it a little bit like an interactive smart board. It was also connected to the internet and things like that. They were just horrifically expensive at the time, and people devoted masses of their budgets and times to try and get all that going. And, you know, along came the tablet, and then just seemed way smarter and probably way cheaper to give every kid a tablet than to have one smartboard that every single teacher was wrestling with who got to use that when. So I just think it's interesting in this idea of how we approach the changing space within which our different, you know, and how we invest in that. I think it's, you know, like I say, in the small press world, the independent publisher was the lifeblood of that world. You know, there were the people who got into the major mainstream presses and things, but the scene, what fomented it, especially among youth, because my perspective is that if youth aren't, some, not everybody is going to, but if some youth aren't getting involved in a literary genre like poetry, then it will just enter the annals of a quaint curio that passed its due date, like the smartboard did. Whereas, you know, I think this idea that you're saying right now, that what is the web without independent artistic work? As, you know, we use that word culture. If we took that as more than just a term, we took its metaphorical implications of how you grow a culture, say in a petri dish. If you're not, that's where the culture foments. That's where it takes new life. That's where it takes new directions. There's beautiful ideas put out by the Russian theorist Mikhail Bakhtin, who suggests that over time, it's the youth rebelling, in a sense, in a literary sense, against the establishment and their way of expressing things, that is actually what causes cultures to gain momentum and take on depth, and for great works to arise over time. It's this constant movement, so that you have a kind of establishment, and then you've got the young up and coming writers who are inventing, wanting to do something different, wanting to shake up the now sort of sedentary and self-congratulatory aspect of a scene, and move it. And it's very interesting to think what happens to that kind of a cultural program when it's online, when it's in web, when it's all diffuse, when there isn't a sense of an established way of doing things. There's just everything all at once. You know, it's the same with music. I'll just throw it out, not to get too distracted. You get him here finally, and he can't shut up. But the same thing with music, you know, like music is dramatically changing because of things like Spotify, because of things like streaming. And how it's changing is people have access to way more music than they used to. It used to be constrained by commercial radio. And if you grew up anywhere around here, you know, it was terrible commercial radio was horrific, just for lack of variety. But now Spotify gives you access to all this stuff, but most people have no clue what they're listening to. They don't know that, oh, I like this song, I like this kind of music. It's running its algorithms to know that, you and Jim and Jim and you and Natasha and blah, blah, you all like this song, so you liked it as well. And Jim and Natasha also like this other song, so we're going to supply that to you. That kind of a network analysis, which is driving people's aesthetic appreciation of music. Also, of course, not challenging it. You're not going to come across something that's radically different in the same way as you might have because you made a friend who liked other things and now you're trying to listen to that. So you've got this constant idea of streams or feeds that are governing people's perception.
Right. It is a little different though with poetry because there's no Spotify for poetry, right? You got to get in and dig. You got to really do some serious Googling around to find the stuff.
Yeah, but I was just thinking how I know you talk about your app as a zine or publishing platform, right? And how when we're thinking about what publishing means now for poetry, right? Like we're talking about books and we're talking about systems and platforms, and you're asking about the back end. But I think there are opportunities without necessarily going into that development, right? There are ways of contributing maybe to Kedrick's app or this app, or it just came to my mind like Instagram poetry, right? Like how much do you need to know in order to publish your poetry, right? So I think there are various ways of engaging people and engaging different groups and someone who is maybe not interested into poetry to do something small. Not to publish a book of poetry, right? But to contribute to the ideas or projects that other people have, or use something that is existing and then make that your own for your own classroom or for your own group that you're interested in, or for your own poetry, right? Because sometimes people, I have my own website, right? And I know something, so I do something on my own, but maybe other people can more contribute and develop.
Another thing that I've gotten into recently is video poetry. There's this whole thing with video poetry now. There's all sorts of festivals around the world that are accepting video poetry.
Isn't it by video?
Well, a poem that's on a video, so it could be anything from somebody, cameras on them reading their poem to I did some collaborations with Adina Karasik recently, and it's a little different from that, but to whatever wild and wonderful thing you can think up, right? So basically, the idea is that it's with video, right? And usually they're available on YouTube or Vimeo, stuff like that.
I'm screening of video poetry at 2:30 today in the theater. Imagine that I'm hosting.
Yeah.
It kind of harkens back to the idea of when music videos first made their mark.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Music video is visual part of the important in the visual poetry.
Sorry, what?
Is visual important in the video poetry?
Yeah, well, it's a very visual medium, of course. So, that opens up a whole different can of worms, doesn't it? I mean, it's like, what can you do that isn't just a poet being photographed reading their poem? Well, you can involve the visual in all sorts of ways that haven't been done before, that are exciting, that are very imaginative.
Yeah, I I hope you'll go to the video poetry to see different projects. But I've done a couple on my own, and sometimes in collaboration with someone who is more visual. I've done on myself, and it's very interesting process because you think about words differently, you think about emotions differently, you try to combine those two expressions, right? Video and written text, and maybe your voice as well, and how that works together. It's really fascinating to do that.
I have a question that circles us back to something we touched on earlier. So, to the point of view of a writer and a fine artist, traditional type, there's always been this idea of leaving a legacy of work behind. So, how do you see that transitioning and being interpreted now we're kind of moving into this impermanence of technology?
Well, there's various projects that I've done. Like I did a project called First Screening, which takes some work by the poet B.P. Nicol, who's a really well-known poet who died in 1987, I believe it was, but very well-known avant-garde multimedia Canadian poet. And he created some computer poems in 83, 84. So project was to make those viewable again. So I think one of the things that a lot of us are involved in is bringing back work from that is now obsolete or unviewable, bringing it back. With my own website, it's continual maintenance. I mean, some of the stuff that I created in like 1998, it's gone through various maintenances to make it viewable now, to keep it viewable. So that in part, you got to be an engineer. You have to engineer this stuff. You don't just put it together, you engineer it so that it lasts, or if it's not going to last forever, so you've got to be able to do maintenance on it. So part of it is an approach that isn't just the old approach, but you're engineering the stuff as well.
The question, was actually going beyond that. So how do you all as modern day techno artists leave a legacy when it becomes?
Can I just, because this is a very interesting question. It's of course much bigger than
2 minutes left, right?
Yeah. I think in my own way, I've had to go through some psychological renovation and rethink what that means. Rethink what that means with, 8, 9, heading towards 10 billion people on this planet. Very different than recognizing an important figure from 100 years ago in a, city of 60,000 people. It's a very different consideration, especially because we think so globally now, and so much, and the sense of time is so rapid. So something that you did today is old within 5 hours. Like this sense that if something, I noticed this in just, another academic reference, but, it suddenly became very unpopular to be citing books that were like 10 years old, never mind 100 years old. You're supposed to have articles cited that were published in the last 3-4 years. So you see this massive compression. So even though there are major fallouts to that, right? Because we're going to start to have to redo work because we just won't know that, that was done in 1967, but
2001 even.
Or 2001, good point. Or 2001 or 2017. Because we're not going back that far in the literature, so that there is this sense that we are collapsing into an instant, into a moment.
And almost into a circular type motion where we're going to have to, almost as a species or a culture, go back and relearn the stuff that we have breadcrumbs we dropped.
Right.
Right.
You know, and if you mean visual art, you know, you think that when the British poet William Blake died, I mean, he was essentially unknown. Yeah, he had a patron, which was a glorious thing of that period, but he was essentially unknown. It wasn't until 150 years later, somebody in an attic found some artwork and thought, we should check into what this is. And then suddenly people were discovering this poet, who was known for one little book that was put out, was this amazing artist who invented this, he called the infernal technique of printing, which is still used today, you know, the reverse plate that gets pressed on a piece of paper. So the interesting thing is, without that legacy aspect, we wouldn't have that part of the history at all. That nobody would really know about that. It wasn't until this discovery many, many years later. And I think there's many examples of that occurring in visual art as well, in fine arts. Oh, we got to,
Yes.
sorry, such an important question. But time is not permitting us to have a legacy.
If I can just say, towards that end, I mean, I'm putting aside some money for the maintenance of my website, and also I'm in touch with people who have made it their job, their profession, to form organization of, you know, doing that with other artists who have websites that hopefully have some value.
And that kind of structure risks to become more and more important as we go forward.
I suppose so.
Connects with finances and like how reports make money. And
Yeah.
a lot of different things to
I hope you'll
And I think legacy is also informed by forcing people to read things. I mean, part of my knowledge of Western classics and all was because of the impact of British colonization. And all of us had to read the same texts. And students don't know these things now because they're coming from areas where they aren't forced to read Shakespeare or, you know, so legacies can be part of like embedding it in some hegemonic structure.
Interesting.
Where you have to read, like all of us read the Daffodils, all of like
Yeah.
William Wordsworth's
Yeah.
poems, and you know, like that was part of English literature in India. So
Boy, I would love to continue that conversation.
Thank you very much for coming.
Yeah.
We really
Yeah.
enjoyed
Lovely.
your questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.